Alien cat girls were sold for meat. One human man spent his last credits. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jacob Thornton never imagined his last credits would be spent on a life-or-death gamble. He had been walking the dusty, dim-lit alleys of a black market station when the deal presented itself. It was supposed to be just another routine purchase, something trivial like a part for his ship, but what he found in the dimly lit market stall was far from ordinary. At first, all he saw were cages, stacked high, filled with strange and colorful beings. But one cage caught his eye, a small, sleek figure inside. Her body was covered in soft fur, and her bright green eyes stared back at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. She looked like a cat, but more. Her long ears twitched nervously as she studied the people around her, eyes shifting from one face to the next. She's pure Etherian. The vendor's voice interrupted his thoughts. Perfect for consumption. Jacob's stomach twisted at the words, disgusted by the coldness of the exchange. She's just a slave, though, the vendor continued with a smirk, a cat girl, ready to be cooked. Jacob had seen plenty of horrors in his time, wars, deaths, betrayal, but nothing prepared him for this. There was a coldness in the man's tone that made Jacob's blood run cold. The vendor's words echoed in his ears, meat, slaughter, sell. He looked into the eyes of the small alien girl again. She didn't belong here. She shouldn't have been here at all. Her life was worth more than this, and somehow, in that moment, Jacob knew he couldn't walk away. His hand moved to his pocket, pulling out the last of his credits. He was sure the amount wasn't enough to buy a ship part, but it was more than enough to save a life. I'll take her, Jacob said, his voice firm. The vendor raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? He asked, clearly amused. You could buy a meal or fuel for your ship with this. You'll be paying for meat, not a person. But Jacob wasn't about to back down. I don't care what you say, he replied. I want her free. She's not your property. The vendor seemed to hesitate, but with a shrug, he accepted the payment. A deal's a deal, he muttered, as he unlocked the cage. Jacob carefully reached inside, his fingers brushing against the fur of the cat girl. You're free now, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't speak. She simply stepped out of the cage and stood before him, unsure of what to do next. Jacob didn't know how she would react. After all, she had likely been through worse. But as he looked down at her, he saw the smallest flicker of hope in her eyes, the first glimmer of light she'd had in who knew how long. He didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment, Jacob knew he had made the right choice. As they walked away from the black market station, the cat girl still kept a cautious distance, but she glanced up at him occasionally. He knew this was just the beginning. She was free now, but freedom was a long road. Jacob had no idea how this would end, but he would make sure she had a chance. Jacob and Lyra walked through the dark, unfamiliar streets of the black market station, the hum of the overhead lights echoing around them. Jacob could feel the weight of the situation settling in. He had just spent his last credits on a life, and now he had no idea where to go next. But as they moved through the crowded, dimly lit alleys, something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. He glanced over at Lyra, her green eyes scanning the surroundings warily, her body tense with uncertainty. Her long, pointed ears flicked at every sound. It was clear that she had been through a lot, and the world outside the cage was as dangerous as the one inside. Where do you want to go? Jacob asked softly, not sure if she'd even respond. Lyra looked up at him, her lips parting to say something, but then she closed them. Again, unsure. She had no words for the situation she was in. Jacob didn't expect her to speak. He didn't know what to say to make this easier for her. She had been a slave, a thing to be sold, and now she was free. But freedom wasn't as simple as it sounded. I can get us out of here, he said, trying to offer reassurance. We can find somewhere safer. Lyra nodded slowly, still keeping her distance, as though unsure of her place beside him. As they passed a small food stall, Jacob noticed the smell of freshly cooked meat wafting through the air. His stomach growled, reminding him that it had been hours since he'd eaten. He turned to Lyra, offering her a hesitant smile. "You hungry?" Lyra glanced at him, but her expression remained guarded. Jacob took it as a yes and stepped forward, placing what little money he had left on the counter. The vendor gave him a small portion of food in exchange. Jacob handed the plate to Lyra, who hesitated before taking it. It was the first real meal she'd likely had in a long time, and she ate it slowly, almost as if savoring it, though her eyes kept darting around, wary of any threats. "You don't have to be afraid," Jacob said, trying to break the silence. "You're safe now." Lyra looked at him, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. She seemed to find none and, for a brief moment, allowed herself to relax. As they continued walking, the mood between them shifted slightly. Jacob could feel her stiffening again, though, as they approached the edge of the station. It was a place that Jacob didn't want to be caught in for too long. Too many eyes, too many dangers. They needed to find shelter, but he had no idea where to go. His old life seemed far away now, and there was nothing left for him in this cold, alien world. He reached a small, dilapidated building at the edge of the market and pushed the door open. It creaked in protest, but the inside was quiet, the air thick with dust. "We'll rest here for the night," Jacob said, glancing over at Lyra. She didn't argue. She simply moved into the corner and sat, her back against the wall, her eyes closing as if the weight of the day had finally caught up with her. Jacob settled on the floor across from her, leaning against the wall. He wasn't sure what the next step was. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her behind. There was something in her eyes, something that told him she was more than just the meat she'd been sold as. She was more than just a slave. And if he could help her, he would. He didn't know why, but he had to. He had no family, no mission, no purpose left. But she gave him a reason to fight. Jacob woke up the next morning to the sound of distant voices and the low hum of the market beginning to stir. He rubbed his eyes, his body sore from sleeping on the hard floor, but he knew he couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. He glanced over at Lyra, still sitting in the corner, her eyes closed as if she was lost in thought. It had been a quiet night, but Jacob could sense that she wasn't quite at ease. The tension in her body said it all. She was still unsure of him, still unsure of the world she was now part of. Jacob got to his feet and walked over to her. "You okay?" he asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Lyra opened her eyes slowly, studying him for a moment before nodding. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice a little more steady than the day before, but there was still an edge to it. "I just don't know what comes next." Jacob paused, then sat down next to her. "I don't know either," he admitted. "But I'm not leaving you here." Lyra looked at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Why?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet curiosity. "I don't know. Maybe it's because you remind me of what's worth fighting for," Jacob said, his tone thoughtful. "I've been through a lot of things, but I've never seen anyone treated the way you were. You don't deserve that." Lyra's eyes softened slightly, though she still didn't fully trust him. "You don't understand," she said, her voice a little quieter. "You saved me, but what do I do now? What do I even have left?" Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not even sure I have a plan. But I'm not about to let you be tossed around like some piece of meat again." Lyra didn't say anything, but she seemed to relax a little. The weight of their situation wasn't going to disappear overnight, but Jacob could sense that she was beginning to feel a bit more hopeful. "I don't need you to fix everything," she said, her voice still carrying a hint of defensiveness. I need to figure out who I am now." Jacob nodded, understanding more than she realized. "I get that. But you don't have to do it alone. You're not alone anymore." For the first time, Lyra met his gaze fully, and Jacob saw something he hadn't noticed before. She was looking at him, not with suspicion, but with the first real sign of gratitude he had seen. The moment lingered between them, and Jacob felt a connection that was stronger than anything he had ever felt before. He didn't know where this road would take them, but in that moment, he knew he would do everything he could to help Lyra find herself again. It wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about her future. And no matter how uncertain that future was, Jacob was determined to stand by her side. "We should get moving," Jacob said after a moment, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here forever. Let's figure out where to go next." Lyra nodded, standing up and dusting herself off. They left the shelter they had found in the dark alley, stepping back into the busy marketplace. The world outside was overwhelming, full of noise and unfamiliar faces, but for the first time, it didn't seem quite as dangerous. Jacob wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was clear: he wouldn't let her face it alone. They had both been lost, but maybe, just maybe, they could find their way forward together. Jacob and Lyra walked through the marketplace, the hustle and bustle of the crowd almost overwhelming. The sounds of alien languages, the clinking of metal, and the hum of distant machinery filled the air. Jacob could feel the tension in Lyra as she stayed close to him, her eyes constantly darting around, scanning the environment for any potential danger. He couldn't blame her. Freedom was new to her, and the world outside the cage was full of unknowns. As they moved past vendors selling strange, brightly colored fruits and mechanical trinkets, Jacob noticed how the people around them seemed to take little notice of the two of them. He could see how Lyra felt out of place, her alien features standing out among the crowd. Her pointed ears twitched nervously, and her tail swished lightly behind her, a constant reminder of the life she had left behind. He understood that feeling. He had often felt out of place in his own life, never quite fitting in anywhere. But now, with Lyra by his side, he wasn't going to let her face this world alone. "Where do we go from here?" Jacob asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lyra turned her head toward him, her eyes hesitant. She didn't have an answer. For the first time in a long while, she didn't seem to know what to do next. Jacob knew that feeling all too well. He had no plan, no clear direction, but he was determined to figure it out. "We'll find somewhere safe," Jacob continued. "Maybe we can get off this station. I know a place where we can lay low for a while." Lyra didn't speak at first, but her expression softened. She had no idea what was next, but there was something in Jacob's voice that made her believe he was going to do everything he could to protect her. She had no reason to trust him yet, but he hadn't let her down. "Not yet. I don't know what I'm supposed to do," Lyra said quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Jacob stopped walking and turned to face her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip gentle but firm. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, his voice soft. "You've been through a lot. You're allowed to take your time. But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We'll take it one step at a time." Lyra met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes, genuine care. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't experienced in a long time. It made her heart ache in a way she couldn't describe. She didn't know where they would go from here, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to figure it all out alone. Jacob gave her a reassuring smile, then turned and started walking again. Lyra hesitated for a moment, but then followed. They didn't know what awaited them beyond the market, but together, they would face whatever came their way. Jacob and Lyra continued to walk through the maze of stalls, their steps in sync. As they passed through the crowds, Jacob couldn't help but think about how far he had come from the man he used to be, the one who didn't care about anything or anyone. Now, with Lyra at his side, he felt a sense of purpose. He didn't have the answers, but he knew that he would fight to make sure she had a future. And that future, whatever it looked like, would not be one of fear, isolation, or slavery. It would be one where she could be free. Lyra walked beside him, her posture a little less stiff, her eyes a little less wary. It wasn't much, but it was progress. And Jacob knew that they were on the right path. Jacob and Lyra walked through the marketplace, their pace steady as they made their way through the crowded, neon-lit streets. The hum of the station, mixed with the chatter of various alien languages, filled the air around them. Lyra, still adjusting to her newfound freedom, kept close to Jacob, her eyes scanning their surroundings nervously. Despite the bustling chaos, Jacob noticed how much more at ease she seemed compared to the day before. There was a sense of calm in her movements now, though she still didn't fully trust the world around her. They moved past vendors selling strange, shimmering fabrics and mechanical gadgets, the scent of unfamiliar spices mixing with the fresh air of the station. Jacob knew they couldn't stay in the marketplace for long. They needed to find a safe place to lay low. "There's a small inn just outside the city," Jacob said, his voice calm as he glanced at Lyra. "We can stay there for the night. It's quiet, no questions asked." Lyra nodded slowly, her tail twitching slightly as she processed the information. She hadn't said much since they left the black market, but Jacob could tell she was thinking. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob smiled, trying to reassure her. "You don't need to thank me. We're in this together now." They continued walking, passing more stalls and shops as the day wore on. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm, golden light over the streets. Jacob could see the flicker of starlight beginning to shine through the station's transparent dome. It was a beautiful sight, but it felt distant, like a world he could never truly be a part of. Still, with Lyra by his side, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. They finally arrived at the inn, a small, unassuming building tucked away from the busy streets. Jacob paid for a room, and they headed upstairs. The room was modest, with a small bed, a worn-out chair, and a window that looked out over the station. Jacob sat down on the bed, stretching his legs out and exhaling deeply. Lyra stood near the window, her gaze distant as she stared out at the stars. Jacob watched her quietly, unsure of what to say. She had been through so much, and he knew she was still processing everything. But he also knew that they couldn't keep running forever. "You're safe here," Jacob said after a moment, breaking the silence. "We can stay for as long as you need." Lyra turned to face him, her green eyes studying him intently. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. Jacob could see the wariness in her gaze, the hesitation in her posture. But then, slowly, she nodded. "I don't know what's next," she admitted quietly. "I don't know who I am anymore." Jacob stood up and walked over to her, offering a reassuring smile. "You'll figure it out," he said gently. "And I'll be here, every step of the way." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes softening just slightly. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time with more sincerity. Jacob didn't respond, but his heart swelled with something he hadn't expected, hope. He wasn't sure where this journey would take them, but he knew one thing. They weren't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. The night passed quietly, the sounds of the station fading into the distance as they both rested. Jacob lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what the future held. But for now, he was content. He had made a promise to Lyra, and he intended to keep it. They would face whatever came next together. The next morning, Jacob and Lyra woke early, the quiet of the room still heavy around them. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting faint rays through the small window, and the soft hum of the station was just beginning to stir. Lyra, who had slept soundly for the first time in what felt like forever, stood by the window, her tail gently swaying as she looked out at the stars. Jacob watched her for a moment, unsure of what to say. There was something different in the way she carried herself now, a sense of calm, though still tinged with uncertainty. It was clear she was still processing everything, but there was a quiet strength in her that hadn't been there the day before. "I guess we should figure out our next move," Jacob said, breaking the silence. He stood up from the bed and walked over to her, his voice steady but soft. Lyra turned to face him, her green eyes meeting his. "I don't know where to go," she said quietly, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. "Everything is so overwhelming." Jacob nodded, understanding her completely. "I know, but we'll figure it out. One step at a time." He paused for a moment, then added, "There's a place I know, just a few days away from here. It's not much, but it's safe. We can start there." Lyra seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding slowly. "I trust you," she said quietly, the words seeming to carry more weight than before. Jacob smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "You don't have to trust me just yet, but I'll do everything I can to make sure you're safe." They spent the morning preparing, Jacob making sure they had everything they needed for the journey. They didn't have much, only the bare necessities, but Jacob wasn't concerned. What mattered now was that they had each other, and that was enough for him. As they left the inn and stepped back into the bustling streets of the station, Jacob felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle in. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he couldn't let that stop him. Lyra needed him, and that was all that mattered. The station was still as chaotic as ever, but this time, Jacob noticed that Lyra seemed more at ease. She walked with a little more confidence, her steps less hesitant. It wasn't much, but it was progress. They moved through the crowds, weaving in and out of the busy marketplace, the constant noise almost deafening in its intensity. Jacob kept a close eye on their surroundings, making sure they weren't being followed. As they reached the outer edge of the station, he glanced over at Lyra. She was quiet, her eyes fixed ahead, but there was something different in her posture, less guarded, more open. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. After a few hours of travel, they reached the outskirts of the station, where the view opened up to a wide expanse of barren land. Jacob knew they couldn't stay here forever, but for now, it was safe. He turned to Lyra, his heart full of determination. "We're going to make it," he said quietly. "Together." Lyra didn't respond right away, but the way she looked at him said it all. She had come to trust him, even if just a little. And that, to Jacob, meant more than anything else. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they were no longer alone. And for the first time in a long while, Jacob allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. They could find a way to build a future, together. Jacob and Lyra continued their journey across the barren landscape, the harsh wind biting at their faces as they walked. The vast expanse of open land seemed endless, stretching out before them under the pale light of the twin moons. Jacob kept his pace steady, glancing back at Lyra every so often. She was still adjusting to the world outside the market, but there was something different in her demeanor now, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Jacob felt a sense of pride. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As the hours passed, the landscape began to change. The flat, barren land slowly gave way to rocky hills, their jagged peaks casting long shadows in the moonlight. Jacob led the way, his footsteps sure and purposeful. Lyra, though cautious, kept up. She was still quiet, her mind clearly processing everything that had happened, but there was less tension in her body now. She seemed to be settling into the rhythm of the journey. "We'll reach the shelter by morning," Jacob said, breaking the silence. "It's not far now." Lyra nodded, her gaze still fixed ahead. She didn't speak, but Jacob could tell that she was grateful for the small reassurance. It was clear that she had been in survival mode for so long, constantly watching for threats, that it was hard for her to let her guard down. But Jacob wasn't going to push her. He understood. They had reached a small, craggy outcropping when Jacob noticed Lyra falter slightly. He stopped and turned toward her. "You all right?" he asked, concern in his voice. Lyra hesitated before nodding. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was quieter than usual. Jacob studied her for a moment, but she didn't meet his gaze. "You sure?" he pressed gently. "You don't have to pretend you're okay all the time." Lyra looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his for the first time in a while. "I don't know how to do this," she said softly. "I've spent my whole life being controlled, being told what to do, who to be. Now I'm free, but I don't know what to do with that freedom." Jacob took a step closer to her, offering a reassuring smile. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You're allowed to take your time, to learn who you are. And you don't have to do it alone." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. For the first time since they met, Jacob saw the faintest glimmer of something in her eyes, trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Jacob believe that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see him not as a savior, but as a friend. "I'll be here," Jacob continued, his voice steady. "I won't leave you. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Lyra's lips parted, but she didn't say anything at first. Then, almost too softly to hear, she spoke. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they held a weight Jacob hadn't expected. She wasn't used to kindness, to people sticking around. Jacob could see that now. It wasn't just the physical scars that had been left on her. It was the emotional ones, the ones that made it so hard for her to trust, to accept help. But he was patient. He wasn't going anywhere. The two of them continued on, the hills growing steeper as they neared the shelter Jacob had promised. They walked in silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts, but the bond between them felt stronger than ever. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were both learning to live again, together. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the rocky landscape, Jacob and Lyra finally reached their destination. The shelter Jacob had spoken of was a small, weathered structure built into the side of a hill. It looked more like a cave than a building, but it was sturdy enough to provide shelter from the harsh winds that swept across the plains. Jacob stepped inside first, his boots echoing against the stone floor as he scanned the interior. It was sparse, just a few makeshift cots, some supplies stacked in the corner, and a small fire pit in the center of the room. It wasn't much, but it was a safe place. Lyra hesitated at the entrance, her eyes darting around the dimly lit space, as if she expected danger to spring from the shadows. Jacob turned to her, offering a reassuring smile. "It's safe," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We can rest here for a while." Lyra nodded slowly, stepping inside but still keeping her distance. She was still adjusting to being in control of her own fate, and Jacob knew that would take time. He didn't push her, though. She needed to come to terms with her new reality on her own. "I'll start the fire," Jacob said, moving toward the fire pit. He gathered some dried wood and carefully arranged it, using a small flint stone to start the flame. The fire crackled to life, casting a warm glow across the room. As the warmth spread, Jacob could see Lyra relax just a little, her body no longer as tense. "You can sit down, you know," Jacob said, glancing over at her. "It's not a throne, but it's comfortable enough." Lyra managed a small smile, though it was faint. "I'm not used to this," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Jacob sat down on one of the cots, his legs stretching out in front of him as he leaned back against the wall. "It's okay," he said, his tone gentle. "None of this is easy, but you're not alone anymore." Lyra's eyes flicked to him briefly before she lowered her gaze. She said nothing for a long while, but Jacob could sense the wheels turning in her mind. She was processing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the past few days. Jacob wasn't sure where their journey would take them next. They couldn't stay here forever, but for now, it was enough to be safe. As the fire burned brighter, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, Jacob couldn't help but think of how far they had come. From the chaos of the marketplace to this quiet moment of respite, they had made it through together. There was still so much to face, but Jacob felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Lyra wasn't just the girl he had saved anymore. She was his companion, and, as unlikely as it seemed, they were in this together. "Thank you," Lyra said suddenly, her voice soft but sincere. Jacob looked at her, surprised by the words. She was staring into the fire, her face partially illuminated by the flickering light. "For what?" he asked, genuinely curious. Lyra turned her head slightly to meet his gaze, her expression unreadable. "For not treating me like a thing," she said quietly. Jacob was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always tried to see people for who they were, not for what they were. But to hear her say it, there was something about it that made the effort feel more real, more significant. "You're not a thing," Jacob replied, his voice firm. "You're a person. You always have been." Lyra nodded, though she didn't say anything more. The fire crackled between them, and for a while, there was nothing but the sound of its warmth filling the room. Neither of them spoke much more that night, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came with understanding, with the unspoken promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The night stretched on, and Jacob eventually fell asleep, his thoughts filled with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't worried. With Lyra by his side, he knew they could make it through anything. The morning after their quiet night in the shelter, Jacob woke to find the light of the twin moons fading, replaced by the first soft rays of the sun. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only the cold remnants of ashes. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the long journey they had taken the day before. As he sat up and rubbed his face, he glanced over at Lyra, who was still sleeping. Her silhouette was relaxed, her breathing steady and calm, an expression of peace on her face that Jacob hadn't seen before. For a moment, he just watched her, feeling a sense of relief. Despite everything that had happened, despite all the uncertainty, they were safe, at least for now. He didn't want to wake her yet, so he quietly gathered his things, preparing for the next part of their journey. He knew that they couldn't stay here forever, but for a brief moment, he allowed himself to enjoy the calm. As Jacob packed the few things they had brought with them, Lyra stirred, slowly waking. She stretched, her tail flicking slightly as she blinked a few times, adjusting to the light. Her eyes met Jacob's, and she offered him a small, hesitant smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice still soft with sleep. "Morning," Jacob replied, his voice warm. "Did you sleep okay?" Lyra nodded slowly. "Better than I have in a long time," she said quietly. Jacob felt a small sense of pride at her words. It wasn't much, but it meant something. "That's good," he said, offering her a smile in return. They both stood up, gathering their things. It was clear that Lyra was still adjusting to her freedom, but Jacob saw that there was something different in the way she carried herself now. She wasn't as tense, as wary. She was beginning to trust him, even if just a little. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Jacob knew that. They had no destination in mind, no clear plan, but they had each other. And that made all the difference. After a few moments of quiet, Jacob spoke again. "I think it's time to go," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We'll keep moving. We'll find somewhere better." Lyra nodded, her eyes focused on him. "I trust you," she said, her voice steady but soft. Jacob gave her a small smile. "I'm glad. We're in this together." With that, they began their journey once more, walking through the rocky terrain as the sun climbed higher into the sky. The land stretched out before them, the rugged hills and sparse vegetation serving as a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The road was uncertain, but Jacob was determined. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that as long as they were together, they could face anything. As they walked side by side, Lyra seemed to settle into the rhythm of the journey, her steps a little more sure, her posture a little less guarded. Jacob could see the subtle changes in her, the way she was starting to take control of her own fate. She was no longer just a survivor. She was becoming someone more. And that gave Jacob hope. The journey ahead was unknown, but it didn't matter. They would face it together, one step at a time.